queen c4. Wow, that's a brilliant move. Hello everybody, how are you guys doing? Let's enjoy another Armageddon game between Wesley So and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Wesley forced to win with the white pieces. Abdu only needs a draw in order to win this match. So c5, and now after c takes d5, e takes d5, we are entering in the Tarrasch variation, where after d4, black gets an isolated pawn for the rest of the game. Shark castle, and Wesley gets the water, trying to be hydrated for the rest of the game. You have a couple of interesting options here. You can take on c5, you can play knight c3, and Wesley is about to take on c5, bishop takes c5, and then a3. The idea behind a3 is to play b4 and then bring the bishop to b2 to the best diagonal. Black can stop that by playing a5, but of course the drawback is the b5 square, which would become weak in that case. h6, prophylactic move versus bishop to g5, and then b4, attacking the bishop retreats back to e7, and then bishop to b2. Look at this bishop on b2, it's the best dancer of the disco, it's the most handsome guy, it's the funniest guy in class, you know? In the best diagonal. There are two approaches against the isolated pawn. You either put pressure against it or you block it. And clearly the blocking square here is d4. Now black plays a5, trying to create counterplay on the queen side. You have two options here. You either take on a5 or you close files with b5, which is very interesting because you actually stop knight c6, which is the most natural square for the b8 knight. But clearly you have to do something, otherwise black will capture twice on b4. b5 is being played, and now knight b to d7. There are two interesting squares for the knight, b6 or c5, right? And here probably knight c3 is the most natural move, and this is what Wesley plays, attacking the d5 pawn, and then knight b6, protecting the pawn on d5. This knight is also intended to jump to c4, and this could be extremely annoying for white since the bishop on b2 could be in trouble. So how to stop that? By playing knight d2? That looks like a very sad move, because you don't want to lose control over the d4 square. Knight a4 is being played by Wesley, and this is a nice idea to trade pieces when you're playing against the isolated pawn, because that pawn could be suffering in many endgames. So black is supposed to keep more pieces on the board, so that's why Abdu plays knight to c4, and then this knight is actually attacking the bishop on b2. Black just wants to get the bishop pair. That's why Wesley plays bishop to d4. Abdusattorov doesn't take that pawn on a3. Instead, he keeps developing pieces with bishop to d7, attacking the pawn on b5, and then queen to b3 by Wesley So, protecting the pawn on b5, protecting the pawn on a3. And Abdu plays knight e4, threatening knight d2, winning an exchange. Rook fd1 played by Wesley So, covering d2 and also putting pressure against the d5 pawn. Now Abdusattorov plays bishop to e6, reinforcing the d5 pawn. Wesley touches some pieces, and now we gotta do something about the a4 knight. That's why Wesley plays knight to b2. What a nice move. Intending to go to f4. The best premium grass is on f4 for that horse, right? Where from f4 you put pressure against e6 and d5. And let's see what black plays here. Abdu goes knight to d6 back. Wow, he also wants to dance. He wants to bring the knight to f5, chasing the bishop on d4, right? Which is the strongest piece by far in white's position. a4, knight to f5, attacking the bishop on d4. You don't have too many squares for that bishop, right? And Wesley ignores the threat and then plays knight to d3, continuing with the plan. After knight d4, you play knight d4, and then you have a nice blockade there. Rook c8, fighting for the c file, and then Wesley So fights also for the c file with rook a to c1. So how to proceed now with the black pieces? Abdu is gonna play queen to d6. Makes a lot of sense, connecting the rooks and fighting for the c file. So now bishop e5, played by Wesley So, queen to b6, putting an eye against the pawn on f2, but still protected by the knight on d3. So that's why Wesley So plays queen to b2. What a nasty move by Wesley, putting more pressure against g7. The idea is just simple. You want to push g4, deflect the knight from f5, and then just capture the free pawn on g7. So how to stop that? You don't want to play f6. It goes bishop f6. Of course, this is in white's favor because trading pieces, as I told you guys, could be bad for black in many endgames. Bishop f6, knight to f6. This is a small victory for Wesley So how to increase pressure now, maybe with knight to f4, maybe just a calm move like e3. He goes knight to d2. The idea is to bring the knight to b3 and then maybe use the c5 square and also put pressure against the a5 pawn with some queen d2 in the future. So Abdusattorov trying to create counterplay here, knight to d4, threatening knight takes e2 with a fork. We need to protect that pawn, knight to f4. Now the first question is e5 working? I think it's not because of knight f3. Knight f3, bishop f3, gf4, and then queen f6. The knight on f6 is not protecting anymore. So that's why bishop g4 is being played. Now putting pressure against the pawn on e2. How to protect that pawn? Knight f1. Wow, what a move by Wesley So, protecting the pawn with the queen on b2 and then intending to bring the knight to e3. Look at all those minor pieces. The knight on e3, the knight on f4, the bishop on g2, a rook on d1. There is tremendous pressure against the pawn on d5. It's going to be extremely hard for Abdu to protect that pawn on d5. Rook d8, and now knight e3 attacking the bishop. The bishop goes back to e6, and probably now rook d1. That looks like winning a pawn for white, right? Because you have 4 pieces attacking the pawn on d5, and then black has just 3 pieces protecting the pawn on d5. So this is going to be free food for Wesley So. He loves free food. Knight takes d5. There we go. Knight takes d5. Bishop takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight takes d5. And then you can actually take with the rook or with the bishop. And Wesley takes with the bishop. There are so many tactical shots on f7. For instance, after queen c5, bishop f7. And rook takes d8, just wins the game on the spot. So Abdu goes knight e7, attacking the bishop. The bishop has to be retreated to b3 to cover the rook on d1. Takes. The rooks are traded. And now this is just a pawn up for white, but it's never easy since black is going to play b6, put all the pawns in the dark squares, and then this bishop is never going to be able to capture any of those pawns on the queen side. There is a weak pawn, which is f7, so probably white is going to try to coordinate queen and bishop against f7. So queen c2, there we go, intending queen to c4 maybe in many positions. Now how to play here? Maybe you can play g6 or g5 and bring the king to g7. And this is what Abdu does. g5, intended to put all the pawns in the dark squares. Now queen e4, centralizing the queen. And now king to g7. It's never easy since black is going to bring the queen to f6, right? After e3, queen f6. And then how to put pressure against f7? It's not possible. So that means that you have to push your pawns on the king side, right? By h4 or f4, king g2, king f8. Now Abdu saying, you know what? I'm going to pass. I'm going to play king f8 and then king g7. But Abdu only has less than 1 minute in the clock, and he still needs to do 20 moves in order to get the increment. Queen a8, king g7, queen e4 back. Now king g7, queen d8. What a nasty move. Now black cannot play king f8, so queen e5. Wow, what is this move? Now the pawn on b6 is just hanging. Can't just Wesley So takes this pawn on b6. There's some check on e4, but then after f3, I don't see any more checks. So he takes the pawn on b6, queen e4 check, f3. Now the queen on b6 also protecting the e3 pawn. That's very important. Probably queen b1 is the idea, attacking the bishop and intend to go for some checks on the second rack. Now queen d4, centralizing the queen with a check. That looks very natural, bringing the queen back to the defense. That's a check. Now f6. Now how to play. The bishop is attacked. Queen c4. Wow, that's a brilliant move. La, ta, 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 ta. Intend to go queen f7. That's a killing blow in this position. After queen b2, there's only king h3 and no more checks. So he's got to go back to g6 to cover f7, but now he's running like a beast with a pawn on the b file. b7, there we go, knight c6, he gets the classes back! This is how it's supposed to be, living young while I'm free. He checks on c6, now b8 with a queen. Probably Wesley So singing ta-da-ta-da-dum-dum, ta-da-ta-da-dum-dum. Hope you guys enjoyed this game. This has been Pepe Cuenca for Chess.com. Big hacks from Spain.